preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
I want to recapitulate briefly what I was talking about last week, just in a few minutes, for those who have not been here. But may I ask, can you hear me clearly? Thank you. I was talking about three topics last week. One, about the concept of religion as we find it in Freud and in Jung. I try to say that for Freud, religion is essentially the belief in a fatherly God and the belief that this fatherly God will help if we are in need. He points out that this is a continuation of our helplessness as children, which still exists in various degrees when we are adult. As children, we were accustomed to rely on Father, and so we continue in the illusion that such a Father exists also in our later life. He says this is an illusion, and not only an illusion, but a dangerous illusion, because it prevents us from developing our reason, our strength, our independence, and has a paralyzing effect. In other words, Freud's criticism of religion is in the name of independence, of truth, of reason, quite regardless of whether his criticism is well-founded or not. Jung's position is exactly the opposite. For him, religion is essentially submission. Submission to what he calls the unconscious, to some wisdom which the human race has inherited and to which we submit. Faith in God or faith in anything is not an active power in ourselves, but a submission to superior wisdom. And I pointed out that Jung's position especially is different from Freud's in one respect, namely that for Jung there exists no question of truth in religion. From Jung's standpoint, whether we worship a heathen idol or whether we worship of the God of the Old or New Testament, or whether we are Buddhists or whatnot, it doesn't make any difference as long as we worship something and submit to this great power which is outside of ourselves. It remains an open question, and maybe I shall give in my lecture an implicit answer. I don't want to go into it now. Who is closer to religion in a sense of our Judeo-Christian tradition? The non-believer Freud, who insists on the truth, or the religious romantic and relativist, Jung, who insists that we must worship something? I was then speaking about four types of religion. The ritualistic religion, which is centered around rituals, the aim of which is to perform magic acts by which we attain something or by which we avoid a danger which otherwise we could not avoid. The second type of religion I spoke of is Orthodox religion. Orthodoxy, which literally means the right belief, which develops theology, a science of God, and which claims that there is a precise and definite knowledge about ultimate reality, that is about God, and only the one who is in complete possession of this knowledge can hope to be saved. The third type of religion I was speaking about is what I call the religion of the law or the religion of the road, in which neither the ritual nor the right belief are essential, but the right way of living, in which what matters is in life whether we apply whatever our knowledge of God or of any spiritual power is to our life as individuals and to historical life, and whether we experience God or know about God essentially by living according to certain attributes of God. And the fourth type of religion I was speaking of was the mystical religion, in which neither ritual, nor the right thought, nor the right action even are essential, but the immediate experience of love, of oneness with God, oneness with all human beings, oneness with nature, and in which the here and now of this immediate experience is that which counts essentially. And then I was speaking about the concept of monotheism. And I had tried to say that what came up in the history of the human race about in the years between, let us say, 1500 BC and 500 BC, is a revolutionary and new idea, namely that there is a supreme principle, the one, which underlies all the manifoldness of all phenomena in the world, in the universe. That this one is the principle, and if we want to understand this principle, we have to develop two qualities in ourselves, one in the realm of thought and one in the realm of feeling. In the realm of thought, it means that I develop my reason, because the essential function of reason is to penetrate through the surface and to go to the kernel, to go to the heart of the matter, to go beyond senses and common sense, and to understand what is behind the phenomena, things and people, which our senses and our common sense observe. And I try to say that reason in this sense is a specifically human phenomenon, while intelligence, which is the use of thought for the better manipulation of things and people, is a phenomenon which is not specifically human, which can be observed in the animal kingdom as well, only in lesser degrees. And in the realm of feeling, the concept of the one means the experience of oneness with all creatures, with all human beings, with all living creatures, and perhaps with all that exists. And if one states that this one which is behind the phenomena is a one which cannot be recognized, which cannot be defined, which cannot be talked about, of which no picture is possible, which all we can to do is to emulate this one, that is to say, to let our lives be guided by what we attribute to the one, then indeed monotheistic religion is a religion which essentially arrives at the demand that the task of man is to develop his reason and to develop his love. And that is the way in which he worships God. I was then speaking toward the end of my lecture last week about the psychological fact that what underlies both the capacity for love and for reason is the ability to overcome narcissism, to overcome that narcissism with which we all start as infants and which we emerge from only to a certain degree. I hope that what I said about narcissism was not too unclear, but nevertheless I might repeat. By narcissism following Freud's description, Freud's definition, I understand that state of mind in which the only reality which exists for me is that which I feel, which I fear, which I want. The reality outside doesn't exist for me at all in a sense of my senses if I'm insane, and in the sense of my affects if I'm not insane but only what they call neurotic. Now, each person and the human race itself has to go through a long process of emerging from this narcissistic state into one in which one relates to the world outside, to things and to people. And there is, however, a great difference. In order to survive, we have to accept reality as it is. If we don't, if we only recognize a reality which is in ourselves, then indeed we couldn't survive. We would be unable to do anything. And the person who is insane is in that state. But in order to survive, we hardly need to overcome our narcissism in our personal relations. You can see everyday people for whom there is no reality in feeling as far as their feeling is concerned, except they themselves. They may be good businessmen, good doctors, good lawyers, good everything. But they are not capable, in relation to people, to overcome that narcissism which in relation to things would make them insane, would make them incapable of managing the outside world at all. And of course this is quite understandable, because the inability to overcome narcissism in relation to things has a penalty, the penalty of death or starvation. the inability to overcome the narcissism to people has no such exact penalty. On the contrary, sometimes these people succeed in making themselves highly admired, only to disappoint those who would admire them after a while. Now, I should like today to continue this topic, but now to talk about the evolution of the concept of God as we find it in the Old Testament, and a little farther, and I there shall speak essentially about the Jewish development, because this is one clear line, and it would be too complicated if I took on at the same time the task of analyzing the concept of God in the Christian or Muslim development. What one can say in general, and of course this would hold true for the Old Testament, in the Old Testament, inasmuch as it is a sacred book for any religion, what we can see is that the new idea of the one which leads us to the development of reason and love, has found the first expression in human history in very crude and very naive forms. This is not only true for religious ideas. You will see in the history of science that a new idea is perceived, but that it's perceived in crude forms, very impurely, that centuries pass until this new idea has found a purer and more adequate expression. And yet it is as almost as if the idea had a life of its own, as if the idea too grew from childhood into maturity. This holds true for the idea of monotheism also. And I shall try now to show you what this development in very general lines is. You might say there are the following stages in the development. First, God the absolute ruler. Second, God the constitutional monarch. Third, the nameless God. And fourth, the God about whom no statement can be made at all. And let me now try to develop this a little bit more concretely. You see in the beginning of the Old Testament, God as the absolute ruler. For instance, after he has made man, he is afraid that man could become like him. If you would read the text sometime tonight or tomorrow, or on Sunday or Saturday, of the first, second, and third chapter of the Genesis, then you will see, after man has eaten from the tree of knowledge, God says, if he would also eat from the tree of life, he could become one of us. And at that moment, he drives him out of paradise. Or, God destroys man almost at the flood because he doesn't like them. He does what a feudal lord does, what an artisan can do with the figure he has created. He decides they are not as I expected them, and he decides to do away with them. But at this very point, the second great phase of the idea of God begins, that which I call the concept of God as a constitutional monarch. Well, this may not be a very fortunate word, but what I mean by it is this, that at a certain point, God ceases to be the absolute ruler, the absolute chief, who can do with men anything he likes, but in which God and man makes a covenant. God becomes bound to his own, to and by his own principles. And man can challenge God in the name of the principles which God represents. The first covenant of God is executed between God and Noah. After God has brought the world to the brink of destruction, as one would say in these days, he does not pride himself that he did it several times. He does not imply that he could it another time. But on the contrary, he enters into a covenant with Noah in which he promises to the human race. This is not an act of grace This is not a hope. This is a promise to which God can be held, that he will never destroy the human race again by water. Then he makes, and it's very important to notice here, if you are interested in the Old Testament, that here the first covenant of God is the covenant of God not with a nation, not with a tribe, not with the Hebrews, but with the human race. Only the second covenant is made with the Hebrew tribe, that's made with Abraham, and even there you find the universal element in it, because in this blessing of Abraham, God promises that he and his seed shall be a blessing for all nations. It is very interesting and very important that the Old Testament, in contrast to most other national myths, is in its very beginning a universal, a story with an emphasis on the universality of God and of man, and only secondarily becomes the story of a particular tribe. Now you have perhaps one of the best examples of this new relationship between God and man, or rather of this new concept of God, if you read in chapter 18 of Genesis, the pleading of Abraham with God, when God intended to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. There, Abraham, in polite forms, as one speaks with a king, but nevertheless, in a way which many kings do not permit, or have not permitted to be spoken to, without killing the speaker. Abraham pleads with God and says, "You, the Lord of all justice, can you really intend to kill the just with the unjust?" And in this beautiful bargain on justice, which you find there, God gives in. The fact is, Abraham remains wrong. There are not even 10. That is to say, there is not even a social core of just ones in Sodom and Gomorrah. But nevertheless, here we see men for the first time in the history of the human race arguing with God, challenging him, because God is now not anymore the God of power, but the God who has promised certain things and who is identified and bound by certain principles. The third stage is a stage which is considerably further, and it is amazing really to see how all this unfolds in the short space of a few chapters in the book of Genesis and Exodus. It is a revelation of God to Moses, when Moses is called upon to lead the Hebrews to freedom. Moses, as you will remember, does not like the task. He is not a politician. He is not a professional enlightener. Yet, like most prophets, are not. And so he gives all sorts of reasons to God why this thing won't work. And what I am interested in here right now is one reason he gives. He says, God has revealed himself to Moses as the God of Abraham, the God of Jacob, and the God of Isaac. Isaac and the God of Jacob. That is to say, the God of history. And I shall have occasion a little later to come back to the historical concept in the Old Testament. God has revealed himself as the God of history. And Moses says to him, "But if I tell these Hebrews who have grown up as idol worshippers that the God of history has called me, how would they believe me?" They need a name. An idol has a name because an idol is something complete, is a thing, is a partial quality made into something finite. An idol needs a name because things need names. But that which is not a thing, that which cannot be defined, which cannot be seen, not because it's hidden somewhere, like a person who is hard to see because so many secretaries watch there, but an idea of the one which is in principle beyond any kind of description and definition, as the idea of the one is in the Old Testament. This one can have no name. because a name, as I said, is only for that which is a thing or a person. So what does God say? He says, all right, tell them a name. Tell them my name is Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. Now, that means in Hebrew, it's often translated, I am who I am. But that's not quite correct, because the Hebrew form is the imperfect. That is to say, you could only translate it, if you want to be translated correctly, I am becoming who I am becoming. It's not the being, but the becoming, which is implied in this. I am the becoming. And if you translate it a little more freely, you could translate, tell them his name is nameless. He cannot have a name, because he is not being, he is becoming. He is something, somebody, some power, some concept about which no finite statement can be made, except that his being is becoming. Now, in this concept of God, God does not even have a name anymore. He is not the God of Abraham, with whom one can talk, so to speak. He is a concept which is beyond any description, definition, and therefore beyond any name. Now, if I may go one step further, and here I am in the development of Jewish theology, I want to invite you to jump over 2,500 years from this period to Maimonides, the great, well, the newspapers would say the Jewish St. Thomas Aquinas, the great Jewish philosopher who, like Thomas Aquinas, but about 100 years earlier, tried to reconcile Aristotelian philosophical concepts with those of traditional Judaism. But in one respect, Maimonides was one more radical thinker than Thomas Aquinas, and one of the most radical thinkers in theology, because Maimonides went one step further than this revelation of God in the Old Testament goes. Maimonides says, we are not permitted to make any statement about any positive attribute of God's existence. We must not speak of God's existence, of his will, of his power, of his wisdom, of his kindness, of his love. We must not speak of any positive attribute of God, because essentially this is idolatry. Essentially that means that we have some concept of God as we would have a concept of an idol, and in some fashion we describe this concept. Maimonides says the only thing we can say about God is what God is not. And he says even here we speak only in an ironical, paradoxical way. Because if we would say what God is not, this could imply that if we could say what God is not, we could say what God is by reversing it. He says we can't do that. It's just as if we would say this wall cannot hear. This is a statement which does not imply what the wall can do. It is only saying enumeratively what the wall cannot do. And then Maimonides asks, well then, if all we know about God is what God is not, what then is the difference between a great prophet like Moses and an insignificant philosopher who knows much less about God? And he comes to the formulation that there is a great difference, because the great prophet knows more about what God is not than the simple philosopher knows what God is not. Or to put it in a different way, Maimonides would say, the more I know what God is not, the more I know what God is. And those of you who are familiar with Lao Tse and Taoist writing will find that this is almost literally a formulation which you find in Lao Tse, in Taoism. The one who knows about the Tao does not talk about it, and the one who talks about it shows that he doesn't know. So you come here in Maimonides to a further development of the concept of God in which, and of course one which in many ways is related to Aristotle's concept, but a much more radical one, in which the statement is made, you cannot say anything about God, you must not make any statement about God, and indeed you should not talk about God at all. I shall come back to this point later on. I could, if I had the time, continue here and go to the next stage, although it's not exactly the next, it's a slightly different development, although it's quite a few hundred years later, and that is Spinoza, where you find a definition of God which says there is no God. But it is in terms of a theological definition, so that for hundreds of years after Spinoza, there was an argument whether he was an atheist or not an atheist. This question is much too simple. Spinoza has continued the process of purifying the concept of God to a point where, and this is only my own opinion, where it doesn't make much difference anymore whether one speaks of God or one does not speak of God, because all that matters from the standpoint of strict monotheism, as already the Bible, later on Maimonides, and later on Spinoza have seen it, all that matters is how we live. The Old Testament has very little or practically no orthodoxy, no emphasis on the right belief, on the right formulation. All its emphasis is on the way of living, both in the individual life career of a person and in the life of the human race through history. You can see that the question which is so often asked when somebody asks you, other, do you believe in God? And you usually get the answer, well, not exactly in a personal God, but, and then the sentence fades out, that this is a rather naive discussion from the standpoint of the development of monotheism. And a little later in this lecture I shall return to this question when I talk about the religious situation today. But now I want to come to a second religious concept in the Old Testament, and that is the concept of man. Aaron may remind those who were not here last time that they are not in the wrong lecture. I try to talk about my views, that is another psychoanalyst, on religion, and try to show what is essential, or what I believe is essential, from the standpoint of the understanding of man in our religious culture, in our religious tradition. Now, if you would again look at the text of Genesis, chapter 1 and 2, any of these days, you will find that there are two stories of creation. One is the creation of nature, in which the whole of nature is created in 6 days, and on the 6th day man is created. But you find that then, in the second chapter, man and woman is created again. Now, you might say, look at this from a standpoint of a critique of the text and from a historical standpoint, and discuss how these two sources have come together and have been combined. But that is a problem which doesn't interest me at the moment, because the question always is, why has whoever blended and combined and edited, if you please, these texts, why has he left the two versions together? Any child can recognize that the versions are different. So I would prefer to say something about the meaning of the two versions, and I think it is very clear that the first story of creation in the 6 days is a creation of nature, and of man as natural man, as part of nature. And the second story of the creation of man is a creation of historical man, is a creation of history, if you please. That makes a difference between the two stories. Now, the first story of the creation of man in chapter 1 is characterized by several important ideas. First, man's function in the world is to rule nature. Second, man is created in God's image. That is to say, man himself participates in the idea or concept of God. Third, man is created male and female together, and not as we see it in the creation of historical man, that the woman is created after the male. Man is created male and female, and man is blessed. Man is blessed. God says after every day that he saw what he did and it was good. And on the sixth day he said he saw what he did and it was very good. This blessing of creation is a very important fact in the whole concept of nature and of man in the Old Testament. This comes before any moral law is given. This affirmation of life, of natural life, as well as of human life, before any obligations are entered, any laws are given, any commandments are given, any punishments are threatened, is very significant for the whole concept of man as we find it there. But then comes the creation of historical man, and that is a very different story. God sets up a prohibition. Man can eat from everything, as you know, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil he must not eat, for in the day, says the text, that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. Now, this is one of those untruths which parents usually use toward their children. They threaten all sorts of things which they don't mean, and this is exactly what God does, because when man has eaten from the tree of knowledge, man doesn't die at all. And in fact, the serpent knows it. One of the things by which he seduces or convinces, if you please, Eve is to say, this is all not true, you will see, you will not die. And they don't. Then we see something where I would like to quote you the text for a moment, because it's a very interesting and important point, which is also in this same story of the creation of historical man. It's chapter 2, verse 18. And the Lord said, it is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helpmeet for him. And out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every fowl of the air, and brought them unto the man to see what he would call them. And whatsoever the man would call every living creature, that was to be the name thereof. And the man gave names to all cattle, and to the fowl of the air, and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found a helpmeet for him. And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs, and closed up the place with flesh instead thereof. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from the man made he a woman, and brought her unto the man. And the man said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and shall be one flesh. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. Now, you see here how at the beginning of his creation of historical man, the Old Testament poses the central issue of man's life, namely his need for relatedness. He cannot be alone. He must be related to somebody. At first, the text tells us, man tries to be related to the animals, which indeed represents an older stage of human development. But this is not satisfactory. The satisfactory answer is only of the male being related to the female, man to woman, that they become one again. And at this point, the woman is created. Here, in this part of the Old Testament, you see already the influence of a patriarchal culture, which probably had overcome and defeated an earlier matriarchal culture, because unless one has some good reasons, one does not distort reality to the point that one has a woman born out of the man, when in reality it's always the other way around. But this victorious male group apparently had to affirm their power, just as the Greeks did when they had the idea that Athene had sprung from Zeus' head. There again, in contrast to an older matriarchal stage, I'm sure, you have the idea to reverse the story and to make man even the creator of women. Then the event happens. Eve decides to eat the apple, to seduce Adam, and if you want any proof that there are still remnants of an older matriarchal world, you can find it. If you look at the two people, Adam is quite obviously what one calls a Yorker Schlemiel. He knows from nothing. He doesn't ask questions. She tells him, eat the apple, and he eats it. And then he's even so stupid to make an excuse which reveals the story right away. And then when it does come out, instead of at least defending his wife, he just accuses her to God. While Eve is a woman with initiative, who does something, who plans all this. And of course, this is a story which comes from an older context in which men were not yet the ruling sex, but women. But whatever happens, they do it. They disobey. They disobey. For the first time in this history of man, you find disobedience. And what happens after the disobedience? The text says, and the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves girdles. Their eyes were opened. The act of disobedience leads to opening their eyes. They wake up. For those of you who are familiar with Eastern literature, religious literature, you will remember what the concept of waking up means, especially in Buddhism, but in all thinking of the East. If you remember the single fact that Buddha means the one the awakened one. And in fact, if you would describe the religious aim of Buddhism, it is exactly to wake up, to be born, to wake up from a slumber. And what the story here says is that when man, for the first time, acts in disobedience of an order, then he wakes up. His waking up is perhaps not too pleasant. He sees that he is naked. That is to say, men and women, having awareness of themselves, see also that they are different. This is not a story which in a Victorian style tells us about the length of bathing dresses and things like that. This is too profound and goes too deep in human history. But what this story tells us is that after man has acted for the first time as an individual, which he did by committing disobedience, then he becomes aware of himself, he becomes aware of his fellow man, in this case the woman, as being different. The two become aware that they are separate, and this separation is not yet bridged by an act of love. Two strangers wake up before they ever love each other to the awareness that they are strangers. And whenever human beings who are intimate in one sense and in another sense experience themselves as strangers because they cannot love each other, whenever they have that experience, they are ashamed. Or you might say they are embarrassed. We all are embarrassed all the time, every day, because we are so remote from our fellow man. And we try to whistle in the dark. That's what we call to make conversation. Now, what is the punishment? The punishment is, the so-called curse of God is to announce conflict between the woman and the animals, between man and the soil, and between man and woman. That is to say, This first act of disobedience leads to the disruption of the original harmony which existed in this paradise, in which man had not been aware of himself yet, and leads to the situation of conflict between man and nature, and man and man and man and woman. Now then, if we evaluate this story, we have to ask ourselves, what may God have thought when Adam ate the apple? And I raise this question for this reason. Actually, with Adam's sin, the history of man begins. The concept of knowledge, of reason, of development, of responsibility, of choice, all this is possible only after the first act of disobedience. The first act of disobedience is the first act of human freedom. And when man expels Adam and Eve from paradise and puts two angels with fiery swords at the entrance to prevent them ever from returning, this is the beginning of human history. Man is on his own. And if you follow the prophetic concept of history, as you find it in most of the prophets, then you see that they have, in contrast to the Christian tradition, not considered Adam's disobedience as a corruption from which man has to be saved. On the contrary, man is right. He justifies his own sin in the process of history. And what is this process of history according to this tradition? It is that man emerges slowly from nature, from mother, that he begins to think, that he begins to grow out and to emerge from natural surroundings, to develop more and more his specifically human capacities, until one day, and this is called by the prophets the Messianic time, he has achieved a degree of humanization, of knowledge, usually called knowledge of God, or knowledge of the right, of mercy, of love, which permits him then to begin a new phase of human history. And that is the phase in which the conflict between man and nature and man is dissolved and a new harmony takes place. But this new harmony is not anymore the primitive, pre-individualistic, pre-conscious harmony which we see described in the paradise story and which we see every day in a little child, in an infant. The infant has this sense of harmony. It does not yet know that you are different. He is one because everything is part of him. But eventually, if man goes through his own development, he arrives at a new harmony, the harmony on the basis of his reason and of his love. You see this so very clearly indicated as the concept of man when in the beginning of when man is created, the last sentence says, "Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and shall be one flesh." That is to say, even here at the very beginning, the idea of love between the sexes is defined or described as a necessity, not only for man not to be alone, but also to leave his parents. The Bible never speaks of the duty to love one's parents. It speaks of the duty to honor one's parents and of the duty to leave them. And it states this very clearly, all motherly talk to the contrary, when it speaks of the very creation of man. And you see the same idea expressed in the description of the history of the Hebrew tribe. When the story of the Hebrew tribe with Abraham begins with the command, "Go and leave the country in which you are born, thy family, and go to a country which I shall make you see." So the history of this tribe begins with leaving one's family, and in the later Jewish tradition it's painted in very vivid colors, the conflict Abraham had with his father, who had a business of selling idols, heathen idols, and how Abraham all destroyed them and whatnot, and his father got very furious. But this is only a more idyllic version of what this sentence in the Bible says more profoundly. Namely, the beginning of history of this tribe is of leaving the natural surroundings and wandering, become free, free from mother and free from the land. And again, if you read the prophetic literature and see there that in the Messianic time the Jews should return to their country, it has the same philosophical meaning which I just described. When man has been born, fully born, when man has waked up from his slumber, when man has become fully awake and truly human, then indeed can he return to the land, can he return to nature, because then he is not anymore in danger of being swallowed by nature, of being destroyed humanly by the incestuous bond to the natural world. I try to show you mainly two concepts of the Judeo-Christian tradition: the concept of God and the concept of man. And I should like now to come to a problem of our own situation today. Namely, what is a present-day religious situation? On the surface, it is just a boom. The churches were never so full, they say, and I think in public opinion polls, 90% of all Americans say they believe in God, and book publishers know that a religious book today have a chance to become bestsellers, just as Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and so on was a bestseller in the 20s. And we see religious crusades, and I heard recently that in the United Nations there are very powerful strivings to change the hour of silence into an hour of worship of God. But if we ask critically, what does all this so-called religious revival really mean from a religious standpoint, then of course we have to ask, what do we mean by religious here? Do we mean religious is any kind, let us say in the Jungian sense, any kind of worship of something, and it doesn't matter what it is? Then of course we have a kind of religious revival. But if we mean religion in the sense of the Judeo-Christian tradition, in the sense of monotheism, then indeed we have to ask, how does this modern contemporary religious revival relate to the concept of monotheism or to the concept of idolatry? I have tried to explain here that the concept of monotheism was the recognition of the one who can never be recognized, but nevertheless served by the development of his attributes in us. That the concept of monotheism is one in which all that matters is not that there is one God against many gods, but that there is a new concept of the one which in principle is beyond any description, recognition, and which is in principle best served by silence as far as God is concerned. On the other hand, I should like to say a few words about the question, what is idolatry? We still send missionaries to the worshippers of idols. The Bible is full of fighting words against the heathen. Let us ask what idolatry is, and maybe, and I'm afraid this is so, our present-day religious revival is a tremendous revival of idolatry. Now, to describe what idolatry is not so easy, but perhaps you permit me to begin with a story which I experienced 2 weeks ago, and which is kind of funny. You may not see any relation, but I shall make the connection. I was driving in a cab with two gentlemen. I hope they are not in the audience. I don't know them. It was a cold day and rather freezing, and the one said to the other that he had to go to Long Island in the car later in the day, and he was really worried about the icy roads. And the other one answered, what do you have to worry? You have a chauffeur. Now, I try to link it up with the problem of idolatry. What has happened here in the thinking of this man? He is not any more aware that his friend will sit in the car, that the reality is that he sits in the car, the roads are icy, and whether he drives or his chauffeur drives makes very little difference. The danger is still there. He has completely split off the chauffeur from reality. The chauffeur has become the embodiment of driving, of safety, of security, so that his friend does not have to worry anymore. Now, to be a little more serious, that's what most of us do when we think of the atomic bomb, for instance. We have a chauffeur, and what can happen? At least we don't need to worry about anything. If we crash, it's the chauffeur's fault, and if we don't, all the better. Now I want to link that up with the real idea of idolatry. What is idolatry? In idolatry, man chooses an object outside of himself, a thing or a plant, something man-made or something natural. He projects his own powers of love, of reason, of beauty unto this thing. He empties himself, as it were, from his own powers and gets in touch with his own powers by submitting to and worshipping this thing unto which he has projected. That is to say, his own powers are not his anymore. He is not alive anymore. He is dead inwardly. He does not love. He does not reason. He does not judge. But he has projected all this unto something outside and only gets it back partly by submission to that, by worship of that, but not anymore as something which is alive in him. And this was indeed the basic difference between monotheism and idol worship. That the whole idea was, since God is not a thing, cannot be defined, since God is a concept on which I cannot project my own powers and then worship, all that matters is that I myself live that which is the attribute of God. Or to put it in the way of the Old Testament, that man is created in the image of God. In man is God himself. And therefore, man does not need to worship God as something alien from over there. But on the contrary, all that matters is the God in man, and all that matters is that man develops those faculties in which he is God. I have tried in a recent book, The Sane Society, to describe the process of idolatry in modern society under the concept of alienation, of the alienation between man and himself and man and his fellow man, in which we set up certain idols which represent our own powers from which we have become alienated. We set up, for instance, the idol of sacrifice. This idol is worshipped in war, in peace not. The very same man who would not hesitate to risk his life in war to save the life of another soldier whom he doesn't know would hesitate indeed to spend $100 on a man whom he doesn't know to save him. In the second case, he calls himself a sucker, or his wife may call him that. And in the first case, he calls himself a dutiful citizen, a patriot, a good soldier. And yet, it's all the same. But this faculty to feel responsible for another person has been taken out of the living concept of my feeling, and it has been put here. This is to be a realist, this is to be a good soldier. In both cases, I worship an idol set up, but I have lost the experience. This is what I feel. the same thing, the same idolatry, and the same alienation, if you want another example, you can find in certain types of love relationship. A man or a woman, whoever it may be, falls madly in love with somebody else. Let us say he is crazy about her. It's true, exactly true. He is crazy. Why? Because he projects in this woman all dreams and desires he ever had. All that is his. There it is now. He worships her, trying to get in touch with that which is beautiful and that which is exciting in the life by worshipping this idol. And of course he finds out after a while that that does not make life so much more interesting. And of course it happens that there is a difference to idol worship in a collective sense, because in an idol which is worshipped by millions of people, you have wonderful institutions and you have wonderful rituals and you have mass processions and God knows what. In a personal idol which you happen to worship, you soon see nobody else is so impressed. And that is very damaging for the idol worship. But the phenomenon is the same. This person who falls, and the word falling is important and significant too, falls into this idol worship, does not love. He does not feel anything of his active power to love. But he has emptied himself and now worships love in an alienated form in another person. You can do that with another person, you can do that with a religious idol, you can do that with the government, you can do that with your boss, and today people even do it with their children. But it is all the same. It is the alienated form of feeling and seeing. This is idolatry. And now let us come to the question. What has our contemporary religious revival to do with monotheism, and what has it to do with idolatry? Well, I would say it has a great deal to do with idolatry. One minister said, I think in the First World War, there are no atheists in the trenches. And one could paraphrase this sentence today and say there are no atheists in front of the atomic bomb. There are no atheists in a world which is so diffuse, so atomized, so empty in many ways, so that the idea of a supreme leader who will guide us if the wisdom of the leaders we have chosen fails is a very reassuring idea. One mistake today can be the last mistake. And therefore the hope that there is a supreme leader who will remedy these mistakes, like a school teacher or father when Johnny has done something which might lead to disaster, is a very pleasant idea. But it is an idea of idolatry. It is the idea of God, as it is crudely said, the man upstairs, or it is the idea of God, as many people feel it today, which is more the idea of the general director of Universe Incorporated, or maybe the chairman of the board. You don't see him, but in an emergency, you might take recourse to him. That, I think, is one element of the present-day religious revival, and that element is clearly idolatric. Now, the other element is something, I don't know whether I should say better or worse. I wouldn't like to choose between these two, and that is a new use of religion for making people more successful. If you read the cases which are discussed by Dr. Peel, then you see there's always an important executive who is in some trouble. Now, let me mention one case, and this is very characteristic. Important executive comes to the minister and says he has a business deal tomorrow with which is the most important deal he'd ever to go through, but he is terribly anxious and jittery. But this is the most important thing in his life, and could the Reverend help him? Now, up to a generation ago, any minister of the gospel, like every rabbi or any priest, would have said, my dear friend, the very fact that you consider a business deal the most important thing in your life, that is what is wrong with you. But not so in this contemporary religious revival. The Reverend says something quite different. He says, I can help you. Here are 3 passages from the Bible. Tomorrow morning you repeat them, and you will make a wonderful showing, and this business will go through. Now, this is as unreligious as anything could be in terms of anything that could be called a Jewish or Christian religious tradition. Here, religion is simply used as a new kind of psychotherapy. It is cheaper than psychoanalysis, and I'm afraid sometimes maybe just as good. It is a new help in the fight, in the competitive fight of our life. It's a new help to be a success. And what Dale Carnegie did, I think, more frankly, and for me, therefore, much more sympathetically, in the 20s, that is today the religious, to a large extent, the function of the religious revival. And there is a strange mixture between psychologists and theologians. Theologians are not so sure that theology really can be sold, as one says, and the psychologists think theology might also help in what they are doing, and so no one is quite sure what he is doing, and thinks if they go together, something better will come. Now, I want to make it clear, I do not want, by saying this, to criticize the goodwill of anybody. I think there's much goodwill behind it, but we cannot help being influenced by the circumstances in which we live. I also do not mean to say that this is all there is to the contemporary religious revival. There are exceptions to that, a good many exceptions to that. And I would even hope that in an audience like this, there are a number of people who neither hope to do better business nor to be saved from stupidities by God, and who have a genuine interest in, if I were old-fashioned, I would say in their soul. But I do think that as a social collective phenomenon, our religious revival is about the greatest danger which monotheistic has suffered or been threatened with in the last 2,000 years, because it implies the danger that the monotheistic idea is transformed into a new form of idolatry, and that God is set up as a new idol in the belief that here we are following a tradition which is sacred to some and exceedingly valuable to others. So, if I may end this lecture by saying,
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.